Thank you for joining us today for Lunch with the Libraries and Museums. My name is Michelle Fitzgerald, and I am the Curator of Collections for Johns Hopkins University Museums, which is made up of the university's two house museums, Homewood and Evergreen. This October, Evergreen Museum and Library will open the exhibition With Profit and Pleasure, which will display examples of our Japanese print collection. Many of these works have never been displayed at Evergreen before, and we are looking forward to sharing them with you all. In anticipation of that exhibit, today we're going to talk about Japanese prints and what has made them so intriguing for generations of artists and museum goers. We'll meet some of the big artists who contributed to this genre and look at how Japanese prints have historically told a global story of cultural and economic exchange that goes well beyond the boundaries of Japan. Let's start by looking at just one print, the artist Utagawa Hiroshige's work, Full Moon at Seiba. Created as part of his print series, The 69 Stations of the Kiso Kaido, Seiba was a stop along a popular domestic trade route. As the moon rises, evening is falling and workers on the water are finishing their job. A cloud drifts over the moon, providing some depth to the work, as if the flat landscape could stretch on forever. The trees in the landscape stretch at angles, creating a sense of a strong wind blowing towards the houses in the background, directing the boatmen towards their homes. Two fishermen pull their poles along a gentle waterway, whose color moves from a dark blue to a light blue shade. That gradation helps to give a sense of the depth and stillness of the water. When all these components are viewed together, we can almost feel the breeze with a little chill to it cut across the water and hear the rustling of the grass and the gentle strokes of the boats in a scene that is at once peaceful and perhaps a little lonely. Hiroshige's landscape of Seiba is part of a larger genre of art, primarily but not exclusively dominated by woodblock prints, known as ukiyo-e. Translated to pictures of the floating world, ukiyo-e tends to produce works that are vibrant, with bold lines and relatively flat planes of color. The floating world that they capture refers to urban entertainment districts that initially comprised of the genre, though ukiyo-e would eventually expand to include more rural scenes like Seiba as well. Within ukiyo-e, there are a variety of themes that we see repeatedly, including portraits of beautiful women, depictions of popular kabuki actors, scenes from history and mythology, as well as landscapes of well-known sites. They capture a certain ability to emphasize the joys of life, whether small or large. These scenes, which can bring us a sense of peace when viewing them, were products of an industry that lasted several centuries. Every ukiyo-e print from the 17th to 19th century was a result of the effort of several artisans working under a publisher who was financially dependent on a print's success. Mostly affordable and rapidly produced, the prints in some ways democratized art in Japan to make it accessible for more people, but also in other ways commodified it. Out-of-fashion prints would sometimes end their domestic life cycle by becoming packing material for products being exported to other countries, which was the initial way that countries in Western Europe first learned of this artistic field. In the mid-19th century, the interest in these prints reached an extreme level of popularity among Western artists and consumers, kickstarting what would be remembered as the Japanese-me movement. Japanese prints generated a long artistic legacy, both inside of Japan and among Western artists, while ironically also evolving in response to global artistic movements happening around the field. The ukiyo-e print is a complex equation of influence and influencer that merits an in-depth understanding. You might be wondering why these prints have ended up in the collection of Evergreen Museum and Library. Many of the prints you will see from the Evergreen collection today are the result of a gift by Martin and Kyoko Huber in 2016. They match well with a generations-long collecting interest by Evergreen's former residents, the Garrett family, whose two generations at Evergreen were in part characterized by a habit of collecting Japanese antiques like netsuke and inro, sometimes through dealers and sometimes through their own visits to Japan in the 1880s and 1890s. The Garrett's collection is on display at Evergreen in our Far East room, where I'm sitting today, which was designed in the 1920s for the display of their collection of East Asian art. For our talk today, I want to introduce you to some specific artists, many of whom are represented in our collection, who created or were inspired by ukiyo-e, and how it generated legacies that crossed time, space, and even materiality in some cases, such as in the example of this wonderful 19th century French plate. But before diving into those impacts, let's go back to the beginning. What is ukiyo-e, and how did this genre evolve into the one that we are familiar with today? Ukiyo-e could be considered the climax of a long legacy of Japanese genre painting. During the early Edo period in the 17th century, when ukiyo-e was first developed, Japan was experiencing a period of peace while under the control of the conservative Tokugawa shogunate. To instill order, the government divided people into 4 classes: warriors, farmers, artisans, and merchants, who were at the bottom. Entertainment districts featuring brothels, theaters, and tea houses became one of the few areas where people of all classes intermingled. Early ukiyo-e printmakers captured these scenes of pleasure and reproduced them as woodblock prints that people could buy as a sort of souvenir of their time in the city. By the mid-18th century, technology had developed to the point where the prints could include color, and some artists became especially known for their use of color pigments, like the red used on the kabuki actors here. Suzuki Harunobu, however, was the first to be credited with producing full-color prints. Harunobu's work, predominantly featuring beautiful women, also snuck in literary references, such as in this work where the woman gazes into a water source during a party, meant to remind the viewer of a ghost story circulating at the time. The artist also began to depict moments beyond the pleasure district in his work, capturing everyday life. Those concepts of a print using literary or artistic references to communicate hidden perspectives and expanding the genre outside of urban entertainment districts laid the groundwork for thematic experimentation for future generations of artists in the 19th century. Then came Prussian blue, which first appeared in Japan in the mid-18th century, but was not widely available until the mid-19th century, when it explodes onto ukiyo-e works. Bolder and less prone to fading than the plant-based blues previously used, its popularity became the inspiration for many of the 19th century works we know today. The centers of ukiyo-e production were often urban areas, with Edo, now present-day Tokyo, being one of the leading centers. Artistic production inside of these cities was divided into schools of artists sharing the same surname between themselves and their students, working in a similar style, thus establishing multi-generational artistic legacies. The production and retail of a Japanese print involved more than artists, though. A publisher would look at their desired market and determine an idea that they wanted to sell. The artist would create an image that, once approved by the publisher and government censor, would then be sent to the block cutter, who would reproduce the artist's works into a piece of wood that would function like a stamp. The block printer would then follow the designs of the artist to color the wood blocks, with each color getting an individual block, and layering them on top of each other to produce the color images we know so well today. Finally, the print arrived at the publisher's shop, where they were purchased and taken home for display. While the process was lengthy, the specializations and reproduction capabilities of a woodblock allowed a publisher to sell several copies of the same print and hope to get their return on their production investment with a profitable sale. While ukiyo-e itself is more of a topical genre, the formation of these schools and a constellation of production in specific urban centers led to a couple of artistic traits that became key characteristics of the ukiyo-e print. For instance, you can reliably see bold line work outlining the shapes on a print. Ukiyo-e prints also tend to play with asymmetry, with subjects or features of a print placed off-center, making the scene look more dynamic. Perspectives might be unique as well, with different angles or close-ups in a scene, making the print feel like a snapshot of a particular moment. Finally, ukiyo-e often features extremely vibrant prints that are set against a flat, bright, but unshaded background. While often silly or playful, ukiyo-e's popularity and capacity for a relatively high volume of distribution was also perceived by government officials as a threat to the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan. As a result, the government placed censorship laws that restricted the depiction of current events and political scandals, along with several other themes that would go in and out of regulation. However, ukiyo-e artists found ways around this by depicting historic or literary scenes that might resonate with present-day events, or depicting possible contemporary figures as animals. Mythology was also heavily utilized to get around censorship laws, such as in this example, where the monstrous catfish Namezu has caught the god of luck napping and has taken the opportunity to create the 1855 Ansei Edo earthquake, which wrought significant destruction upon the city. Inside Namezu, we see a depiction of that earthquake and a creative means of distributing information about a catastrophic event. Among all the ukiyo-e artists, Utagawa Hiroshige and Katsushika Hokusai set the tone for mid-19th century prints due to their impressive volume, popularity, and the high number of their prints that would later be exported to Europe. These two artists make up the bulk of Evergreen's collection and generated a lot of the prints you're probably picturing when you think of Japanese prints. Despite being stylistically different from each other, their experimentation with ukiyo-e set the stage for the genre's popularity globally. During Utagawa Hiroshige's nearly 50-year career, the artist is believed to have created somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 print designs. He was particularly interested in creating bird and flower prints and images of famous places, which he designed for guidebooks, which were becoming increasingly popular during a domestic travel boom within Japan. Hiroshige was born Ando Tokutaro into a low-ranking samurai family living in Edo. While he was appointed fire warden of Edo Castle at an early age, he, like many other low-ranking retainers in the Tokugawa shogunate, took a second job and began to apprentice at the studio of Otagawa Toyohiro. By the 1830s, Hiroshige had passed the fire warden position to his son, adopted the name Utagawa Hiroshige, and began to work on prints full-time. Hiroshige's work in general could be considered a form of poetic realism. While his landscapes that he is known for were based on famous places, they were drawn from memory and arranged in a way that best suits the emotional mission of the image, rather than being strictly accurate as scenes. His landscapes generally prioritize mood, weather, and light. You might see a lot of scenes incorporating rainfall with Hiroshige. But what is perhaps most interesting about him is the composition of his works. There is a distinct foreground in this image that works to frame the scene beyond and create a perception of depth that previously had not really been seen in ukiyo-e. Hiroshige also started to play with the idea of centering images to create an overall composition that, for Western viewers, might be a little familiar. And that's because Hiroshige was experimenting with the use of Western influences, including the geometric angles and perspectives of Renaissance art that he is seeing through copies and decorative arts in the import-export market. You will also see a lot of the Prussian blue we talked about earlier in Hiroshige's work, adding one more Western influence into the mix, as you can see in the water and the sky here, in a gradient technique known as bokashi. But perhaps no one is better known for their employment of Prussian blue and bokashi than Katsushika Hokusai. Over the course of his career, Hokusai worked under many names, at least 30 during his lifetime, resulting in over 30,000 works, marking a career that employed a wide range of styles and experimentation. With each new shift in style, he took on a new name, but today we tend to refer to him only as Hokusai to avoid confusion. Like Hiroshige, Hokusai was born in Edo, but not to a family with an official role in the shogunate, and began his apprenticeship as an artist officially at age 14. Over the course of his career, Hokusai lived in at least 93 different homes and was known for idiosyncratic habits, including a famous story when, in a meeting with the shogun, Hokusai allegedly brought a chicken with him, and when asked to demonstrate his painting skills, he painted a long blue streak and then allowed the chicken to run across the paper, calling the work an expression of the traditional poetic theme of maple leaves on the river. Hokusai is perhaps most well known for his depictions of landscapes and ghosts, which offers a nice summation of the artist's range and tendency towards eccentric experimentation. Hokusai is believed to have studied Dutch and French engravings that had entered Japan through the Dutch trading post at Nagasaki, and used these to refine his technique, resulting in works that are quite different from the ukiyo-e we had seen earlier. Many of his works feature a low horizon line, a common technique in Dutch landscape painting. He plays with linear perspective, like you see here, which helps to create an illusion of three-dimensional depth. Hokusai also employed shading to create light and shadow in his works, which was quite different from his predecessor's preferences for flat color in prints. As an artist, Hokusai expanded what ukiyo-e was as a genre and helped to shift the focus of ukiyo-e away from the entertainment district to also including landscapes, plants, animals, and supernatural themes. As you can see in this work, his lines tend to be sweeping and dynamic. His subjects often include people participating in everyday life, and these subjects, regardless of class, were depicted with a certain amount of dignity. And his perspective and attention to detail is remarkable. Looking at this example, you can see how the arrangement of the oars mirrors the shape of Mount Fuji in the background, connecting these two subjects across several miles. When considering the work of Hokusai and the work of Hiroshige together, you see a pattern emerge of a traditional Japanese art that, by the mid-19th century, had begun to experiment with influences from outside of Japan, like the Netherlands, France, Italy, and China, even while Japan was following isolationist policies. Even before trade began openly and in earnest, this was an artistic medium that was already experiencing this thematic and technical growth. Beginning in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry led the forcible opening of Japan using gunboat diplomacy. This event, along with the brewing internal tensions, eventually led to the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate and the rise of the Meiji government in 1868, where Japan began to rapidly westernize. In art, one of the results of this was a new audience for the ukiyo-e print. Western art movements like Impressionism and Post-Impressionism in the second half of the 19th century were critically influenced by a craze for all things Japanese becoming rapidly accessible in Europe upon the forcible opening of Japan. But the ukiyo-e print held a place of specific influence. While Japanese objects had entered Europe centuries before the 1850s, the opportunity for more direct trading routes increased the volume of products arriving. The objects exported from Japan, often antiques like ceramics or furniture, were packaged with discarded paper, much like we do with newspapers today. Back then, though, it was ukiyo-e, which then became particularly popular in the 1860s in France. Meanwhile, in Japan, Hokusai had been producing volumes of drawing instruction as a means of producing income intermittently throughout his career. Called his manga, the bound sketches were affordable, easily transportable, and offered valuable lessons in how to accomplish Japanese artistic interpretations of movement and color. Artists and collectors who had engaged early on in Europe with Japanese art acquired copies of these manga for study, while patron collectors began to eagerly acquire other antiques coming abroad. Soon enough, specific shops, such as the one owned by Louise and Émile Desoye in Paris, served as a joint collecting and educational site for the arts community of people like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, James Whistler, Edmond de Goncourt, and more. The Desoye shop was the first in Paris to specialize in objects directly imported from Japan. It initially sold garments, books, and lacquerware, but quickly expanded to a wider range of products like ivories, enamels, and weaponry, providing a shopping opportunity, yes, but also a means of exposure to a wide range of Japanese crafts without ever having to leave Europe. Artist letters from the period demonstrate a certain amount of competition between artists to acquire Japanese imports from these shops, as the letter from the artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti indicates when he writes to his sister, quote, "All the costumes were being snapped up by a French artist to sew, who it seems is doing 3 Japanese pictures. She," meaning the mistress of the shop, "told me with a great deal of laughing about Whistler's consternation at my collection of china," end quote. To get a sense of what Rossetti means by Japanese pictures and how collecting, particularly of ukiyo-e, manifested in European art, it would be impossible to talk about it without mentioning British-American painter James McNeill Whistler. In the 1860s and 1870s, Whistler became particularly enamored with collecting Japanese ceramics, prints, and more, and utilized them in his art. In some examples, they are explicitly present as objects, as you see in the collection of ukiyo-e represented in this painting. In others, you can see his interpretation of specific characteristics of ukiyo-e turning into characteristics of a Whistler work. His signature of the butterfly that he uses in some paintings, for instance, mimics the format and style of artist signatures on Japanese prints. Whistler's Thames series of prints is particularly good at this, capturing similar themes that he had seen in many of Hiroshige and Hokusai's landscape works. This series centers the London River, romanticizing the work of the everyday. Views are cut off, again, like a candid snapshot, and perspective is more layered rather than adopting the Renaissance forms European artists would have been traditionally trained in. You can see a good example of how he used prints as inspiration for composition in his painting Variation in Flesh Color and Green, The Balcony, which pretty directly pulls from a specific Japanese print. Other artists pulled different but still direct themes from ukiyo-e. Another significant example would be Vincent van Gogh, whose atmospheric paintings, like the one you see here, echo the same experimentation with mood, light, and weather that we saw earlier in Hiroshige's landscapes. In fact, Van Gogh directly copies a few pieces of Hiroshige's prints that he could get access to and then embellishes their frames to look, to him, more Japanese. He did more than directly copy, though. Van Gogh found a couple of key characteristics of Japanese prints, particularly inspirational, such as the vibrant, flat colors that his work is now well known for, once writing, quote, "After some time, your vision changes. You see with a Japanese eye. You feel color differently," end quote. Van Gogh also experimented with techniques in Japanese prints that had not yet really been utilized in Western painting. He particularly loved the use of lines to create the texture and impression of movement in nature. As he wrote in one letter, quote, "If we study Japanese art, we see a man who is undoubtedly wise, philosophic, and intelligent, who spends his time studying a single blade of grass," end quote. And of course, Van Gogh's themes resonate with the Japanese print, as he sought to bring the natural landscape around him dignity and joy in everyday scenes, encouraging us with his vibrant colors to delight in the magic of the world around us. While Whistler derived his inspiration from tangible collections, Van Gogh saw his Japan as an imaginative destination, stating that he would rather never visit the country because it would not be the same one that he has dreamed up in his mind that inspired his work. There are more Western artists in this period than one could cover in a lunchtime lecture who directly employ Japanese prints as muses for their works. From Edgar Degas' fascination with movement and the body, with at least one of his ballet dancers directly mimicking a movement depicted in Hokusai's manga, to the flat, vibrant colors, bold line, and mixture of plain backgrounds with patterns employed by Mary Cassatt. The Nabis, a group of artists who signaled the transition from Impressionism to Neo-Impressionism, include Edouard Vuillard, whose interior scenes drew their pattern, color, and composition from Japanese prints. Other artists interestingly created a sort of cyclical cultural exchange. Alphonse Mucha, a household symbol of the Art Nouveau, employed a lot of characteristics from Japanese prints we know well at this point, and then, after his death, became a source of inspiration for works in 20th and 21st century Japanese manga and video games. And Gustav Klimt takes us into the 20th century with his use of patterns and flat colors. Ukiyo-e offered a completely new understanding of art that revolutionized Renaissance-based Western conceptions. The cultural exchange of this artistic genre evolves into its next stage when these Western artists then take these techniques back to Japan during an era of rapid Westernization in the 19th century. In Japan, the sudden increase in Western tourists and collectors, as well as the new Meiji government's endorsement of rapid Westernization, led to fears from Japanese and Westerners alike of a dying purity to the country's traditional culture and art. However, ukiyo-e's legacy very much so endured into the 20th century, perhaps because of this fear of a dying culture. The genre of art, which RA pulled from a global range of influences, continued to naturally evolve through descendant artistic traditions. This new generation of art embodied various aspects of ukiyo-e as a means of reclaiming a national artistic identity in a global 20th century world. By the turn of the 20th century, the Meiji government's approach of Eastern ethics, Western sciences, had drastically altered the appearance of cities. Everything from transportation and architecture to civilian clothing began to westernize and industrialize, alongside more traditional practices. Ukiyo-e was similarly absorbed in this rapid shift within the Japanese world. In Japan, the introduction of photography and another printing form, lithography, were cheaper and faster to produce than woodblock prints, making them more suitable to capturing current events and popular fads. Synthetic dyes that had been recently introduced with trade did make coloring woodblock prints cheaper, but their colors were brighter and less attractive. The new focus on modernization made ukiyo-e appear outdated. If we were to create a family tree for ukiyo-e, there are two primary descendant forms that rose in the early 20th century. There has been some debate between the artists and early critics about which is the true descendant, but as you will see, both adopt different components of the print form for their different global goals. To put it simply, Shinhanga, or the New Prints movement, followed the ukiyo-e manufacturing tradition of specialized artisans working at distinct stages of production. Shinhanga prints typically followed ukiyo-e favored subject types while employing Western concepts of space and light. Meanwhile, Sosaku-hanga, or the creative print movement, followed a concept they described as self-drawn, self-carved, self-painted. For this group of artists, Sosaku-hanga emphasized these works as products of a solo artist and their personal expression, following a new rising interest in the individual among Japanese cultural psyche. While emphasis on a collaborative work versus a solo project sound inherently at odds, these two genres of woodblock print had a decent amount of overlap, with several artists working inside of both schools. Current events outside of the world of art had particular impacts on these schools. In 1923, the destructive 8.0 magnitude Great Kanto earthquake killed approximately 105 to 140,000 people and flattened large sections of major urban areas. At the same time, cultural and economic turmoil in Japan fostered a sense of rising nationalism and a romanticization of the past. At a time when reality felt inescapable, peaceful landscapes became particularly appealing. The Shinhanga print was centered around a group of artists who worked with publisher Watanabe Shozaburo, who sought to embrace the past as part of the modern age. The images depicted a romantic, nostalgic view of Japan. Among Watanabe's contracted artists, one of the most well-known was Hasoi Kawase. This image by Hasoi in the Evergreen collection was one of the artist's favorites and feels like a legacy of Hiroshige's landscapes. Rather than drawing from memory, like the 19th century artists Hiroshige and Hokusai, Hasoi would make sketches of views on location and then embellish details, often placing humans and villages within a natural landscape. The romantic legacies of Shinhanga were particularly attractive and collectible with American and European pre-war tourists in Japan. However, while some viewed Shinhanga as entirely influenced by this Western market, these nostalgic views were rooted in a daily experience of the artist's home country. Kazumatsu Shiro, for instance, incorporated nostalgia into urban environments and conveyed a greater sense of modernity. However, while Shiro's early career was characterized by the Shinhanga movement, he experimented with carving his own pieces and produced work that firmly placed him in the Sosaku-hanga movement, highlighting how these two fields could be interchanged. After World War II, Sosaku-hanga became significantly more popular, outgrowing Shinhanga in the art markets. Comparing this image of Shiro's Into the Woods with his other work on the previous slide, we see art that still plays with water, reflection, and light, but with lines that are more curvilinear and chunkier. While Shinhanga had its roots initially in one studio, Sosaku-hanga developed through an informal study group referred to as the First Thursday Society that ran from 1939 until 1955. The group comprised of aspiring and established print artists who sought to create a camaraderie and support network in gaining public attention to prints as an art form. Up to this point, most Japanese printmaking was considered more commercial product than a work of art within Japan. However, Sosaku-hanga utilized European perspectives on print as an artistic medium to lift up their own artistic field of Japanese woodblock printing. The result of efforts by Sosaku-hanga offered freedom to the Japanese woodblock printing community to experiment with scenes and establish them as valuable pieces of fine art through limited print runs and campaigning for exhibitions and galleries. Ultimately, these two seemingly divergent art fields had similar goals. Like Shinhanga, Sosaku-hanga does use the Japanese landscape as a primary source of inspiration, and especially experiments with man-made work, living within a natural landscape. While Shinhanga preserved the technical production of ukiyo-e into another generation, Sosaku-hanga reinterpreted the genre into a world of global fine art. The story of ukiyo-e is a global one, and that is never truer than in its ongoing legacy in art today. As ukiyo-e collectors in the 18th and 19th centuries connected with these prints that beautified their everyday lives, many of those themes elicit the same reactions among us today. Modern ukiyo-e artists, like the generations before them, identify with the genre from its technique, aesthetic appearance, or theme, interpreting them in art in their own ways. One example of this is contemporary artist Keiji Shinohara. He trained for 10 years in woodblock printing and the traditional ukiyo-e style, adopting a lot of his technical approach in a way that is rooted in tradition and fused with contemporary Western paintings and an interest in abstraction. In his artist statement on his work, he says, quote, "For me, the story behind the work is very important. There's a sense of narrative that is very private. The feelings and emotions I convey through these abstract landscapes matter the most to me." These modern artists who work in the ukiyo-e style continue to evolve from this genre, capturing themes that continue to resonate with modern viewers. Masami Teraoka is particularly well known for adopting the style of woodblock prints and incorporating elements of American pop art to communicate themes of cultural interaction and sexuality. Teraoka has said, quote, "In my mix, the people and props that I use are symbols of both the contemporary life I experience and of the venerable Japanese traditions I admire." Beyond fine art, the reason many people know the names Hiroshige and Hokusai are their prevalence in popular culture. Hokusai's iconic Great Wave, for example, has appeared on everything from couture dresses to school notebooks, and immersive exhibitions work to bring his art to life for a new generation. Still, that point of the complexity of artistic influence that draws from a global stage, as well as simple financial concerns, is a critical point to consider when we talk about ukiyo-e, along with many other genres of art. These are genres that are constantly evolving and influencing, sometimes under the guise of new names, while other times directly paying homage to artists, cultures, fantasies, and themes of past generations. With that in mind, let's return to the full moon at Seiba for a moment. This print was first produced well over 150 years ago, yet it can still elicit emotions from us today. I think that's exactly the magic of it. Whether it makes you feel calm, lonely, playful, or wistful, ukiyo-e captures a certain indescribable feeling of life that anyone can connect to regardless of cultural background. What the future holds in store for descendants of this genre, I can't say, but for today, we know it can still make us smile. I hope you have enjoyed this preview of Evergreen's print collection and the artistic world that surrounds them. If you would like to learn more, please come to our upcoming exhibition, With Profit and Pleasure, which will be opening at Evergreen Museum and Library on October 8th, 2026. Thank you. Hello and welcome again. I'm happy to be joining you live now as we shift to the Q&A portion of our broadcast. I'm also delighted to be joined by my colleague, Amy Mulvihill, Associate Director of Communications and Marketing for Johns Hopkins University Museums, to help manage our questions queue. We encourage everyone watching live to utilize the Hopkins at Home chat to leave your questions, and we're going to do our best to respond to as many as we can. So welcome, Amy.
Hi, thanks for having me here, Michelle. And what a great video. I think we all learned a lot already, but there definitely are some questions in the chat, so let's get to them. First, we have a question from Mark, and he asks, did any of the actual wood blocks survive? And if so, are they ever exhibited?
Yeah, that's a good question. If we're talking specifically about the Edo and Meiji period woodblocks, so those done in the 19th century mostly, yes, some survive, but it's very, very rare. I think there might be a couple survivors in museums in Japan and their collections, particularly in Tokyo, but they're very, very exceptional survivors. And there's a reason for that. When you're making a woodblock print, over time, that woodblock is going to wear down. It can only do so many impressions where you get those really sharp, crisp lines. And so they would become not usable at a certain point. You would need to recarve the block. Also, these are businesses that are running at the time. So if a print isn't selling very well or has stopped selling well, it's a storage problem where you have these big, chunky pieces of wood. And so they would end up being used in those cases as firewood. They might be disposed of in other ways. And then there's also a lot of destruction that happens where these publishing houses are in urban areas during World War II and during some of these earthquakes that we mentioned in the talk. So there's a lot of natural and man-made reasons that these woodblock prints no longer, or these woodblock pieces no longer survive.
Interesting. Mark did have another question. So I guess we'll bundle the Mark questions. And so he asked, your video emphasized that there was a lot of exchange happening between Western artists and these Japanese artists, and it went both ways. And he said it's interesting to know that Western painters may have been looking at particular Japanese artists. Do we know which Western artists the Japanese were studying and pulling from?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it kind of allows me to talk about one of my favorite artists in this exhibition too. But there is a whole, I guess you say, genre of Japanese art called yoga, and that is where they are pulling from Western artistic traditions. They're mostly pulling from Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, so Matisse, Picasso, Degas. And so, interestingly, there are some artists in that mix that are pulling from ukiyo-e in their works, and it's sort of flipping back to Japan in this period. So they're looking at a lot of the artists that Western artists are also looking at to inspire their Western art. And they're incorporating that and studying and playing with that. And you see it, especially in yoga, because they're directly doing it in that genre, but it also becomes part of their training in artistic schools, especially during the Meiji period, where they're really interested in Western culture and industrialization. So it sort of permeates a lot of different genres. We have one piece, it's currently on display at Evergreen if you go through a tour, but it's also going to go into this exhibition to be featured by Fujita. And he was born in Japan, he was trained in Japan, and he moves to Paris in the early 20th century and really reaches sort of the peak of his career in the 1920s in Paris. And he has this wonderful quote. I'm not going to attempt to quote him directly from memory, but he has this great quote where he's saying, he's trying to make this career in Paris. He's inspired by these artists around him. But he's like, what makes me special as an artist? What's my selling point? And he's like, well, I can do Japanese art in a way that these men certainly cannot. And he specializes in this print style and this painting style that really focuses on these ink-like brush strokes and fuses that with Western styles of orientation in the images. And he also really likes painting cats because they were cheaper than hiring models. So he has some great cat art if people are fond of that. And the piece we have does have him with a cat in it. So come see it.
So everybody has that to look forward to.
Right.
Cat art.
We love it.
Yeah, we do. Okay. And then, so speaking of Evergreen's collection, we got a question from Cindy, who said that you mentioned that the Garrett family traveled to Japan in the late 1800s. Is there any record of how onerous or expensive that trip was? And how common was it for Western tourists to visit Japan at the time?
Yeah, so there's different members of the Garrett family who there appear to be from the photo archive. We have a couple of different visits to Japan. The one that we know the most about, and the one that I've certainly pulled the most information from in my research, is when John Wirt Garrett goes in 1899, and he's going as part of a Hopkins trip to the Philippines, and they stop over in Japan for, I want to say, about a week, and he keeps a diary during that of the trip over on the ship, of his time in the Philippines, but also in this stop in Japan. And you can see on his experience with that trip, he spends a lot of time with his friends antiquing. They're going to these Western designed hotels that have these specialty cocktails and these
Mhm.
ports. He's interacting with other members of Western society who are living or traveling in Japan in that period. They go to a royal garden party. Like they're definitely getting this certain elite exclusive tourist experience when he's there. And the big expense in going to Japan in this period is definitely having the time, the capacity, and the money to pay for that voyage over on the ship. So the fact that they can go does mark a certain amount of privilege and wealth that the family has. But it is popular for those who can afford it at the time. So it's I'm trying to think of like the equivalent destination today for people in the United States. But it's sort of a fashionable destination to go to if you can afford to and you have the means to. You do have a couple of famous individuals in particular who visit. Charles Longfellow, so the son of the Longfellow, when he's there as a bachelor, goes over to Japan and gets a ton of tattoos on
Mhm.
him. And he poses for all these pictures and does like this whole souvenir thing. And so there's definitely a feeling of it being special and exotic to go to, but it was popular, though expensive.
Well, and can you just say, you mentioned tattoos. Can you say if John Work Garrett of Evergreen got a tattoo while he was in Japan?
He may have gotten a tattoo while he was in Japan. Was one of our discoveries in this exhibit. Yeah,
Fascinating.
just a little one.
And he was a very sort of well-dressed, sort of conservative presenting gentleman, right? So you would not necessarily expect that he would have had a tattoo at that time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We're going to have a program about this while this exhibit's up. So I encourage everyone who's interested in this to wait for that to learn a lot more. But the connection between tattoos in this period and woodblock prints is actually quite close, and so I encourage you to keep up with the programming. I don't want to spoil anything about it.
Yeah, but there's a connection there. There's
There is,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, all right. Well, so then we've got another question here from Alan, and it's about the printmaking process. And he asks, am I correct that each color of a woodblock print required a different woodblock? If so, how were the woodblock cutters able to align the different layers?
Yeah, so all of the different people in this process. So we talked a little bit about this in the talk, but there's several different skill sets involved. And the person who is laying out these wood blocks, that is their skill set, is able to lay all these different colors. Each wood block would be a different color in this situation. So when you are looking at a piece that has that like an immense number of colors, just think about the amount of skill that went into that. Uh, I don't know if I could go into the specifics on how it's lined up, but they do use a register in a lot of woodblock printing. So there is a sort of space where you can line up and make sure you're in the right area. And the Japanese, and that's speaking to the Western woodblock printing process that I'm aware of. I'm not certain if that's exactly the same in the Japanese woodblock printing process, but I would assume they're using some sort of register.
Interesting. And so we have another question about the artistic process. It says, today's artists often are able to travel abroad and have their work evolve through artist residencies. Do you know if anything like that existed for the artists in the past?
I would say the closest equivalent in Japan, in 19th century Japan, is the schools. So they would study with a specific woodblock or a specific master, artist master. And if they really start working in that style, they would contribute to that artist's works as well. So they might help with designing certain parts of a landscape that you see. So not every Hiroshige print is every single detail hand drawn by Hiroshige. There might be some of his students involved. And uh, they would take the name of that school. if they continue to work with that, if the master gives them that name. Um, if they decide to no longer work in that style, or they're interested in another style or learning in another fashion, they might potentially move schools. They might take up another sort of a genre to work within. And in the 19th century, that typically aligned with when they would change their name. So we call Hokusai Hokusai, but that is one of many names that he works under in his lifetime because he is changing styles. Whereas Hiroshige, the name Utagawa, comes from an artist school, and he is sort of a legacy of that school. So that's probably the closest to artistic legacies for 19th century Japan.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, what I was thinking of, and please let me know if I'm like way off base here, but when I was when I was hearing you talk about the schools and the sort of the master that everybody apprenticed under, I mean, it made me think a little bit of like Andy Warhol and the factory, and you know,
Yes.
there were
Yeah.
like lots of people just dropping in, and it's a collaborative process and sort of an anonymous process at the same time.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's
Yes.
okay.
Yes, I think that's something, and I say this coming from a decorative arts background, but I
Mhm.
think that's something that's important for us to keep in mind with pieces of art is that so frequently there are multiple people at play and producing a work in either directly or indirectly. And that I think is beautiful. That doesn't uh cheapen the one name that might be tied to it. It's a whole process and a whole bunch of different skill sets that make these works.
Yeah. And maybe it speaks a little bit to sort of the collective, the emphasis on the collective in Japanese culture versus sort of the American or the Western emphasis on the individual. Um,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes, and you see that with the 20th century schools dividing.
yeah.
So Shinhanga really keeps up that collaborative
Hmm.
production style that you see, whereas Sosaku Hanga is really experimenting with the idea of one producer of an image.
Yeah. So we've got another question here about artistic process and materials from Sophie. It says, you mentioned two kinds of ink, traditional and more contemporary. Can you talk about the ink used in your collection, how well it is held up, and any efforts to conserve?
Yes, that would be a wonderful question for a conservator. So I'm not going to go too deep into this. But I can talk to you about the conservation of our prints and their preservation. So most of our prints range, as you saw in this talk, from uh, Edo era to, I would say, actually, we have late 18th century prints in the mix to 20th century prints. So we have different types of ink. But we do have a lot of Prussian blue. And we do have also inks that are a little more fugitive. So exposure to light with Japanese prints in general is is a really really good way to get them to fade rather quickly. And so one of the things that's exciting about this exhibition is these are prints, some of which we have never displayed. They stay in storage most of their life to keep them in the dark as much as possible. And the way we brought in our wonderful conservation lab at Sheridan Libraries to consult with us on this. We had a couple of meetings and discussions with other conservators about this. And the way we are working with this exhibition is when you go, you're always going to see original prints there. But there's also always going to be some that have their repros out instead. So each individual print in this exhibit, the original of it is only going to be out for about a 3-month span. But they'll all have, anytime you go, you're going to see an original somewhere in
Right,
there.
it'll be on a cycle. So some will get
Yes.
wrapped and then, but there'll always be originals on view. Um, yeah, I mean, that's very, really exciting. Because I mean, they are so delicate. So the chance to display them at all is Is really cool. And we did
Yes.
have another question about the exhibition from Mumtaz, and he said he asked how many prints will be on display.
Oh my gosh. I don't know if I can give you a specific number off the top of my head, but I believe we have about 40 objects going into this exhibition.
Yeah.
Of those, I would say probably high 20s are
Mhm.
prints. But then the rest of the objects, there's a good number of them that come from the Garrett Library that are going to be out on display, some of our rare book collection. And that includes publications that circulated around this period and were part of this discourse. So I'm not sure if I don't believe I mentioned Christopher Dresser in this talk, but he is an interior designer in the UK at this time and becomes really enamored with Japanese antiques for retail, Japanese design. And he publishes this beautiful book on these designs. And that is an example of another sort of connected object that's going to be in this exhibit as well.
And I think we should probably remind people that the exhibition opens in October, and
Yes.
you are furiously at work on it as we speak. So it's still, it's still a little in flux, right? You haven't made absolutely final decisions yet on objects, or have you?
No, that's a good question. The about the exhibit process. So
Yeah.
the objects are selected. Those that need to be are at framers. Some are in our lab getting mounts made for their display. So they're all sort of busy with their uh, preparations, as it
Mhm.
were. Where we're currently at in this exhibit process is the label copy is off at our designers right now. They are working on the design for this exhibition, and we will be making probably another round or two of edits once we have them in with the design.
Yeah. And I think it's always, I mean, I'm always very impressed with, how much care and research goes into these exhibitions. I know it takes a long time. I mean, you are always working like several years out on, whatever the next exhibition is going to be. So a lot goes into these exhibitions, and I feel like that's important to note because they are products of a lot of collaboration with our colleagues across the division, and then a lot of research, that is performed by yourself. And I think you've traveled, right? You visited Japan recently.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like there's a lot that goes into these. So I think that's always good to remind people, and that there's always, there will be ways for people to get involved in the exhibition when it opens in October. You mentioned that there will be programming surrounding the exhibition. There are also ways to support these exhibitions. They take a lot of resources. So if people are interested, we can drop a link in the chat, and they are welcome to help us support the good work that goes into all of these. Um, so I think with that, oh, somebody did ask in the chat, Claire asked, is the exhibition going to be at Evergreen? And we can say yes,
Yes,
definitively
yes,
yes, it will.
yes. It
Um,
opens October 8th.
yeah.
And yeah, you can visit it anytime you come to Evergreen after that point, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., Tuesday through Sunday.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again, Michelle, for the sneak peek of the upcoming exhibition. We're all very excited about it. To learn more, you can go to the JHU Museum's website. That is museums.jhu.edu. I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in to listen to our conversation today and who asked questions in the chat. For more information and to register for other virtual programs, please go to hopkinsathome.jhu.edu. And thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of your Friday.